welcome back to the Purple Cloud podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Mattias Daly, returning this time as a guest of the podcast, not as the host as he was 2 episodes ago when he interviewed Dr. Ilya Mozias in Taiwan. Today Mattias joins us to talk about his most recent translation for Purple Cloud Press, which is The Heart Treasure of Taijiquan. Now available for purchase on our website www.purplecloudinstitute.com or on amazon.com at a slightly more expensive price. The Heart Treasure of Taijiquan is a book originally written in Chinese by Ren Gang, a highly advanced practitioner of Tai Chi living in Shanghai, who Mattias had the good fortune of training with. Throughout the text, Mattias translates the original work as well as sharing his own insights into Master Ren Gang's training, which we discuss in quite a bit of depth in the podcast. So, without further ado, let's get into the interview. So, welcome to the Purple Cloud podcast. I'd like to welcome Mattias Daly back again, this time as a guest, not as a host. How are you, Mattias?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
And you have just translated a book, the Heart Treasure of Taijiquan by Ren Gang.
Yeah.
And yes. I've had a chance to read over this the last week. It is a fantastic read from what I've read of it, and I was just wondering if you could sort of fill the listeners in on how you got interested in this subject, a little bit about your own sort of Tai Chi training and your martial arts lineages, and how you learn about Ren Gang and end up translating this book.
All right. Well, I wrote a bit about it in the translator's introduction, so I'm sorry for any listeners who are going to have to hear this story twice, but I kind of started doing Shaolin Kung Fu in Chicago when I was 15 with Master Juan Cortez and Sifu Antoine Wiley, which was a life-changing, life course-altering encounter in my teenage years. And then I was very lucky, and I was introduced to a Taoist teacher in the suburbs of Chicago who had practiced in 2 different Taoist lineages. He's quite a low-key person, so I won't name drop here out of respect for him, but that was also pretty life-changing as well, and especially in my early 20s when I was more looking for direction, having kind of gone wild for a few years in my late teens and early 20s and hit a few brick walls. And that, going back and seeking out that Taoist teacher I had met kind of ended up being a launch pad into moving to China, learning Chinese, and eventually studying Chinese medicine. And all along that road, keeping up martial arts practice, but sort of moving quite frequently. And so bouncing from teacher to teacher, but gradually gravitating more and more towards internal martial arts, with a big interest in Wudang martial arts, and as well Baguazhang, and eventually Xingyiquan, Taijiquan. And after about, maybe 15 or more years of this whole process, eventually kind of feeling like I had gotten to where I could get with forms and external training, and feeling that although I had dabbled in and really by then I'd spent actually I guess about 10 years in the so-called internal martial arts, still feeling like I had not really tasted Neigong or the real internal teachings, even though definitely my health and mental state had benefited a lot. I mean, I think martial arts made it possible to stay sane in Beijing while working through medical school.
I feel you on that one. Yeah, I feel you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this in the first show. I think the first time we bumped into each other was in Ditan Park. It
was.
Under those trees, man. It was just the fact that martial arts made me go outside, even in those, horribly polluted days or cold days, rainy days, but just go out and be under the trees. It was good.
A little bit of refuge of nature.
Yes.
Little pockets.
And some routine and some quiet and just getting the body moving. And then, after I graduated from TCM school and I was back in the US and living very close to our classmate, Jeff Chen, he and I started to hang out about once a week to train together, like really all day. And he had been training for a similar amount of time and encountered a kind of a similar bottleneck. And we, just really having nothing better to do other than train all day once a week, we just started to put down most of the techniques we had learned and the external things and just try to sort of how to put it, like unearth and really explore what we thought might be the core of the internal teachings that neither of us had really grasped. And as this was happening, we really did, over the course of about half of a year, make some huge progress that shocked even us. And what really surprised me was that the way we were describing to each other and understanding for ourselves what we were doing differently sounded very similar to what was expressed by this fellow in Shanghai, Ren Gang, this Taijiquan master in Yang style Taijiquan, who a good friend of mine, Zhong Yang, is his disciple and had introduced me to him in around 2010. And then I went and heard him talk a couple of times, and I just kind of was like, who is this guy? Like, he doesn't look like a badass. He's just kind of this soft-spoken, very good skin, very nice clothes, a little bit of hairspray, gentleman who's sitting here talking about the Heart Sutra and the Tao Te Ching as though they have any martial application. And, despite my great interest in the philosophy of Taoism and Buddhism, I didn't really think that the things he was saying were likely to be representative of any martial understanding whatsoever. Even though I had a kung fu brother in Shanghai who had immaculate form in internal martial arts and had once twisted my arm extremely gently and immobilized me, and him being effortless and me in no pain, just sort of like oddly immobilized. And he's just like, he's telling me that that's what he learned from his master, who was also Ren Gang's master, or one of his teachers rather, who was also Ren Gang's master, and said, even he didn't really understand the things that are coming out of Ren Gang's mouth, but that if I ever got the chance to touch hands with Ren Gang, I shouldn't pass it up because the man's got the juice, so to speak. And that was still years earlier. Like, it hadn't been enough to convince me I should seek out Ren Gang, but these experiences Jeff and I had over the course of 6 months of really hard training together, opened my eyes that, when you get internal, you start to feel philosophy inside of your own body. And it does stop being so much of a question of raw strength and viciousness, as, that's what a lot of martial arts up to a very high level is about, raw strength and viciousness. So I got in contact with Zhong Yang because 2 years earlier he had asked if I would be willing to translate Ren Gang's book, and I was kind of like, nah, I'm not interested. But I was like, hey, next time I'm in Shanghai, can I come check you guys out? And Zhong Yang arranged a meeting, and I was duly impressed and humbled after touching hands with Ren Gang. And fortunately, he had a pretty high opinion of my translation ability, and so the project took off from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great story, and what really resonated with me is when you were talking about, and he talks about a lot in the book, when the idea of it being a way of embodying Chinese culture and a way of you mentioned the philosophy, which is inclusive of the culture and very much highly related, but you start to understand it on a physical level, and it's a way of getting in touch with this and expressing it. And I found something quite similar. I mean, it started when I was in Beijing, and it's obviously a slow process. You're always learning. You always have realizations or whatever, but it's what it's what started to bring the words on the page in Chinese medicine alive, because a lot of the theory and the language is the same in these, especially the internal martial arts and the medicine.
Right.
So a lot of my understanding of the medicine, especially in the earlier days, was very much shaped by these experiences with training. So it was great to see that. I mean, he's obviously gone into it on a hugely deep level, and he ties in Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, everything, and like the whole of Chinese culture into the practice of Tai Chi.
Well, and I think, and what I want to emphasize though is what I think sets Ren Gang apart, for better or for worse, from a lot of teachers, is that, I met a lot of martial arts teachers, Qigong teachers, TCM teachers, and practitioners over the years who can talk the talk. They can quote from the Tao Te Ching or whatever. And they do have some skill, like they're not useless with acupuncture or herbs or martial arts perhaps. But, at the end of the day, you spend enough time around them and you're like, there's a gap between the philosophy that they're quoting and the level of skill they have. And the level of skill they have is not that amazing. And it's certainly nothing on a level where you're like, they have touched a way of doing things that's markedly different than what it would be for someone who didn't understand this philosophy. And frankly, let's be honest, there's a lot of internal martial artists who've kind of ended up getting humiliated. In the last few years.
Oh, the whole Shu Xiaodong thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Which shows up in the book, And, Ren Gang, I'm pretty satisfied as someone who could take me in a fight without resorting to just, basically foregoing his internal martial arts training and just swinging wildly. He's got something tangible and real. And he's also, in a way, his door is open to people to come visit him and seek him out. He's not sort of like, I'm publishing this book, no one come find me. It's very, very much the opposite. It's like, I think the time for hiding behind walls of secrecy and protocol to kind of not put my skills out for people to really test. He thinks that time has gone on too long in internal martial arts and it's causing a lot of damage. So he's hoping to play a part in rectifying that.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me from reading this book was the idea of embodying philosophy and traditional Chinese culture through the movement practice of Tai Chi. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, how sort of the philosophies of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism are put into a practical application through this kind of practice.
I think it's a really interesting and important question, and I feel like it's going to be impossible to really address it from all angles in this, in a short answer, which is why it takes, years to learn these things. But I guess the first thing that Ren wants to emphasize over and over again, like why you need to have a practice like Taijiquan, and not necessarily a martial art, and not even necessarily a physical exercise, but if one is to choose a method to try to make one's understanding of the philosophy go beyond, he loves to make this reference to like something that you can pat your stomach and chat about. Chat about where you're patting your stomach after a big dinner, which I'm sure, having lived in China and attended many, probably pretty drunken banquets where people are overstuffed with food at the round table and, enjoying a little bit of baijiu buzz, start to take these flights of philosophical fancy. And it's easy to sort of have such grand and grandiloquent theories falling from your mouth that you think that you get it because you feel like you get it because it feels so good to talk about these things. But, there's that...
Yeah, and it's often with someone with a toothpick hanging out of their mouth, I find, while they're patting their belly.
And probably some pretty damn bad breath if you get too close to them. Always a him. Always a him. Let's put that, I say women are almost entirely innocent of this. So, and there's that term I'm sure you know from Chinese, or two terms. One, 身体力行. So, if you'd made a really ugly direct translation, just body, strong, undertake, right? But really it's to like use your effort to bring something into practice through your body. And then, of course, another one, are variations, 体会, 体验, 体悟. So in all three cases, you have 体 at the beginning, body, and then 验 to experience it, 会 to understand it, 悟 to have like a deep insight, even an epiphany on the basis of it. But again, none of those three terms leave the body. And this is something that Ren, harps upon to his credit. I'm not saying that in a negative way, that it's so easy to sort of get carried away by the philosophy and then mix it to something like martial arts. But at the end of the day, you're not getting in the ring. You don't live in a dangerous neighborhood necessarily. You're never actually having to fight. And it becomes a kind of a fantasy kung fu. And so at a very basic level, his way of seeing the training is that it should change your body, and it should change the way you move. It should change the way you feel space. And in fact, if you do spar, or if you, God forbid, have to defend yourself from an attacker, you will not just be flailing wildly, having forgotten, all your thousands of hours of Tai Chi practice and your thousands of hours of reading the Tao Te Ching or whatever. And why is that? It's because there's this core beauty to the way that especially Taoist philosophy can really alter a person's being. And the reason for that is very simple. It's just that, we as Taoists understand it, are all products of the same bifurcation of ineffable, intangible oneness of the Tao in the yin and yang, and then further on into the 10,000 things. And then so reversing that direction from Tao giving birth to one giving birth to two giving birth to three, a three giving birth to 10,000 things, no matter where you start from, you're still going back to the same source. And so this means that the same process that changes your mind invariably changes your body, because your body and your mind are inseparable and they come from the same source. And again, what really separates what I just said from being kind of, frankly speaking, new age hogwash is the proof in the pudding or not? And let's be realistic. Most of us are not trying to be in the ring. I'm not interested in a fighting career. There are not even that many people I know I want to spar with, because, not everyone can be trusted to spar in a civilized manner.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And I'm certainly not trying to live in a dangerous neighborhood if I can avoid it, right? But where else does this manifest? It will change your body. From a very fundamental level, you're basically, what we all have once we've reached adulthood, and probably even before then, is a body that's racked with accumulated sequelae from old injuries, poor posture, and basically, low levels of qi and poorly distributed qi in the body, creating blockages, which is why aches and pains just multiply as a person ages, and posture starts to become less and less symmetrical, less and less upright, and has that sort of, that beauty of healthy posture that's like healthy young piece of bamboo or pine, defying gravity and yet not stiffly. We should all have that, and we lose it. And you can't fake that to yourself either. Like if your aches and pains are disappearing and your stiffness is melting away, and I'm talking about in a very palpable manner. Like, I can sit in full lotus now, and I do no stretching, I do no yoga whatsoever, having practiced with Ren Gang's instructions for just under 3 years. And I have very few aches and pains in my body, compared to, I started to have plenty of them when I was in my teens. And so where does this all come from? It comes from essentially finding a one in both body and mind. And it so happens that the one that these Yang-style Taijiquan teachings that Ren offers, and which he believes trace back to the Taoist Zhang Sanfeng, in his teachings is how to use the Mingmen. The Mingmen becomes the center. It becomes the core. It becomes the one of the body and the mind in movement. And by learning how to govern all movement of qi and physique from the Mingmen, one essentially is walking again that reversal path from 10,000 things to 3 to 2 to 1.
Just a side note, it's really interesting talking and hearing about your experiences with that reversal of, I guess it's a reversal of the aging process and the aches and pains. He talks a lot about lengthening soft tissues, opening the skeleton, and also about Zhanzhuang practice, which is the, I guess, standing stake, standing meditation practice. I don't know how much you know about my history, but I had maybe 30, probably more shoulder dislocations starting from a very young age, and I tried literally everything, yoga, physio, everything.
I know. I do know you've had some pretty serious acupuncture too.
I will say the thing that helped me the most and got me to a point where I was actually able to even start to do other things was Zhanzhuang practice, and like serious, committed, daily. It's magical, and I understand some of what it's doing. I don't think I understand its the full scope of the practice yet, but it maybe you can. I'm imagining when you were talking just now about how you've been following his tutelage for the last 3 years, that Zhanzhuang makes
3 years.
that makes up a fair amount of this kind of training, or.
I have to confess, I did learn Zhanzhuang from Ren Gang, and I did stick with his instructions on it for about 8 months. But I have a Taoist teacher here in Taipei, and I do most of my Zhanzhuang in that style.
Oh,
but
that's
100% of my.
Yeah, I was just wondering what the difference is between the two styles.
Okay, well, I want to add, I do 100% of my movement exercise with Ren Gang Neigong instruction, and it's exactly the same as is written in the book. There's no other secret or anything like that. Ren is very open, and so what I mean by that is I had learned the 5 basic fists of Xing Yi Quan from 2 different teachers in China, one in Shanghai and one in Beijing, with some variations between the two, and also. I learned, single palm change from a couple of, I think 4 different Baguazhang teachers, and all taught it a little bit differently. But eventually, I purely practiced these, moving from the Mingmen, which is Ren's core instruction. And there's more to it than just that, but it's detailed in the book. And basically, the physical form of all of those practices, the Xing Yi Quan and the Bagua, has subtly, gradually, but also very in the end, very profoundly changed, because the way in which my body moves is it can no longer be just simply mimicking the way you walk, the way you move that I was taught by my former teachers, and this sort of addresses your question, which is that my experience is when you're moving from the Mingmen, and again, Ren is saying the Mingmen is not an axle point in your body. It's not even really meant to be. The most important thing isn't the location of it or some like new way that somebody teaches you to move. It's rather putting your mind there and letting that area govern your movement. And Ren makes a very subtle point on one of his sections of the book that could easily be overlooked by readers. But he says that when you practice in such a way that you have a distribution of weight, so that you have one foot empty and the other foot holding weight, combined with the Mingmen teachings, you will have a result that mirrors what, for example, the I Jing Jing, the tendon changing classic, is doing. And I can't explain why it works this way, but I can say it's absolutely true in my experience. And what begins to happen, I believe, that as the mind settles upon that part of the body and that part of the body becomes active at the same time, and there are these differentials between xu and shi, between substantial and insubstantial, or empty and solid in the body, it just naturally triggers a lengthening of the tendons, and that pulls the bones further apart and naturally allows the skeletal structure to begin to return to a level of balance and symmetry. Obviously, not in a single day or even in a single year. And this is why, for example, my quad, my hips, and my lower back have opened up enough that I can sit not in like a perfect full lotus, but in a full lotus. And sometimes until I get bored of sitting that way. Other times until I hurt too much and I decide to give it up. So I don't want people to think that after 3 years, every single little problem has been resolved. It's not a magic bullet, but it is remarkable in my experience.
Yeah, right. That's really interesting. And I've seen one of in the book, the core instructions, especially in the beginning, is straightening the waist.
Yes.
And what does he mean by this exactly? I've never seen him sort of move, so I'm wondering if you could explain it a bit.
Super important question. I think my answer, I'm happy to share this, and I hope it's of use to other people. Basically, I mentioned before that Jeff Chen and I, when we were training together in Connecticut in late 2017, both of us, we only got together about once a week to practice, but we were practicing alone in the interim, and we had both sort of made this determination that we would stop, mimicking forms or trying to remember, was my arm supposed to be here or supposed to be there, and let me look at a video and refresh my memory of what this is supposed to look like, and put all that stuff aside and feel it in our bodies. And I noticed if I started to train any movement that I had learned in the martial arts in such a way that I did not feel force, weight, and strength getting stuck in any part of my body, that invariably, if I reached my arm back and rubbed my lumbar area, the waist was straight, which frankly was anathema to quite a few of the teachers I had trained with before, which is, I don't want to make the claim that it's always wrong to have a rounded lumbar, rounded Mingmen region. Ren is asked about this many times in the question and answer section in his book, and all he says is it's not a part of Yang style Taijiquan, and he doesn't know where it came from. He doesn't, offer a sweeping critique and say it should never exist in any martial arts training regimen. All I can say is I was really surprised that as I was moving away from just rote repetition of what other people had shown me to do and towards truly listening to the interior of my body, I was finding my waist straightening and lengthening. And there's a book called 8 Steps to a Pain-Free Back by an acupuncturist in the United States called Esther Gokle. It's a fantastic book. And one of the things I love about it is that she has photos of what she considers to be healthy back posture from people all around the world. Most of them from traditional cultures that have not sort of gravitated towards living on sofas and in cars, and where people have an unbroken connection to understanding of how to use the body and manual labor. And she's got these great photographs. And I was like, my back is starting to look like that. So anyone who's curious about what a healthy, elongated, straightened back looks like, there are no pictures directly of a naked back in Ren's book, unfortunately. There are pictures of Yang Chengfu that we hope illustrate this. But if you want to see, in my opinion, a really beautiful illustration, it's 8 Steps to a Pain-Free Back. Just flip through it. I'm sure you can get it in the library in many places. And you'll see very healthy looking spines.
It's really interesting because I want to ask my teacher about this. The style I've done most for the last 10 years or so is Wuxing Tongbei or Taiji Tongbei. So it's a fusion of young style Tongbei, young style Tai Chi with Tongbei. And one of the instructions we're often given is Shoufu Liu Tun, which is you pull in the belly and drop the buttocks at the same time. And I haven't asked my teacher this, but I'm just now like kind of doing it, and the effect I think is to straighten the waist, and it drops as you drop the buttock, the lumbar spine will naturally. Anyway, it's something I need to ask my teacher about, because there might be different language around these things.
Right.
Yeah, because I've not heard this straighten the waist instruction before, but it does resonate with me.
Yeah, and you can see it in the old photos of Yang Chengfu, both as a young man and in his later years that we have in the book. And regarding what you just said about dropping the buttocks and pulling in the stomach, again, like in Ren's book, you get a lot of sort of sub instructions. But again, it always comes back to straighten the waist, move from the Mingmen, lift the Mingmen, right? And my personal experience over the last 3 years has been, although it's important to pay attention to the sub-instructions and occasionally ask myself, are they taking place? What's even more remarkable is that if I simply simplify the practice and remind myself, just return to the Mingmen moves first, everything moves after. The Mingmen governs. Don't move anything before the Mingmen. Don't let anything be separate from the Mingmen.
And when you're saying Mingmen, it's the similar anatomical location we'd all be aware of. Yeah.
But nobody should take this as like I've got to find a way to like zero my brain in onto a coordinate that looks just like an acupuncture chart.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. And so when I'm doing that, and so I'm simplifying, I'm kind of in a Taoist way, forgetting all the sub instructions, just returning the core instruction, and I move. And this is the thing, you have to practice. And then it's like, oh, the sub instructions begin to happen spontaneously of their own accord. And so, like you just mentioned, the stomach coming in, the buttocks dropping down, that happens naturally and spontaneously as a reaction to the qi of the spine becoming ample and full and open, which allows the spine to relax in such a way that as it lengthens, naturally the buttocks drop. And so Ren frequently talks in the book about how you should have a feeling like your legs are hanging down from the Mingmen, which is quite contrary to, I think, what a lot of us instinctually want to do. It's like, I want to have a strong leg foundation. I want to feel like I'm powering up through it. And as I throw a punch, like my legs are roaring as they, smash down into the earth, which creates a reverse force. And so I feel like my punch is really strong, right? And then you see like Kung Fu movies, that's how people want to punch, right? And certainly a lot of people are trained that way. And certainly it will make you punch harder. But Ren's point is that's not really internal martial arts. Internal martial arts, as he understands it, the legs are totally agile and hanging down from Mingmen, which I think relates to the buttocks sinking in the instruction you just mentioned, possibly. But of course, I hope you ask your master, and I'll be interested to know what he says.
Yeah. I think there's it's definitely it's to do something with the lower back, but I've never heard the whole straighten the waist instruction. But I think in all these different styles, there's a lot of different language around these. So, but I do like this idea of just like focusing in on just one thing, the simplicity of Mingmen. What's also quite interesting, I think we've talked about this before, but how you get a practical, and this again relates to the sort of philosophy side of thing, of his idea of it being an embodiment of Chinese culture and ways of understanding. In that, we spent 5 years at university learning Mingmen and learning words like Shen and Qi and all of this, and really having very little, I would say, if to use, we both studied with Andrew Nugent, had tangible experience in the classroom. My access to all of this stuff was through martial arts and these words, which have an overlap with the medicine, like, like Shen and Qi and Mingmen and things like this. And then you really develop a very different understanding than just reading these things in books. And I think Ren Gang, that's, from what I've read in the book, that's partly his point in the book.
For certain. I mean, he's not a man to disparage book learning for when he's selling a book.
Yeah, for sure.
He talks a lot, but again, it's that risk of people just kind of absorb it, and in the Chinese milieu that he's used to, it turns into big roundtable banquets and everybody sitting around quoting Buddha and Confucius and feeling very smart. And I think what we might see is keyboard warriors.
Yeah.
Lambasting each other on YouTube comment sections and web forums. It's like, okay, well, you can read 15 martial arts books and you can certainly talk the talk, but there's a big gulf between that and your body really and truly changing, and your mind as well, which is another benefit, is that as your Jing, Qi, and Shen become ample and open and more evenly distributed, invariably you have a higher quality of life and sense of well-being, and if not even just happiness, which is certainly a beautiful side effect.
Most definitely. And going back to the ideas of understanding these concepts, one of the big one, which is mentioned several times in the book, is you translated as Qi with a lowercase q and Qi with an uppercase q, which are two different characters, and he makes quite an effort to sort of distinguish these two. Maybe you could discuss it a bit and let the listeners know a little bit about his thoughts.
Okay, so these characters, I'm sure for readers, especially readers who are new to this genre, will provide something of a headache. And I commiserate with readers, and I will express that it was tough for me to figure out how to translate it, because it's, they're pronounced the exact same way, and their meanings are very related, and in some cases overlap, and even worse in some cases, one of the characters is used to imply the other, because Chinese is sort of, it's a very long intellectual tradition with many different writers who approach the use of language in different ways. But if I'm going to sort of take a step back and break it into two relatively digestible chunks, uppercase Q, Qi, written with a simplified version of the character Wu from Wu Wei, or Nan, or No, or Un. Underneath that is 4 dots that can represent fire. Now, I had a small caveat. The upper character is actually the character Ji, and the lower character, in addition to meaning, or the lower component, in addition to meaning fire, can also mean 4 legs on an animal. But the common explanation for this character for Qi, which is far less common than what we usually see. It's not the Qi from Qigong. It's not the Qi that Chinese medicine talks about. Is generally what it refers to as what we would call prior heaven, or xiantian qi. And this is an energy that is of the Tao. In fact, you could say that, and in another book I'm translating by Ge Guolong, he makes the point that, the Tao can be spoken of as the Tao, or you could also refer to it as energy, in which case you would use this character or call it xiantian qi, prior heaven qi. What does this mean to us on a practical level? Well, prior heaven qi is formless and shapeless. So it's not like the qi Chinese medicine talks about that may come from food or even from the environment at large, or even if you get a qigong, like the different types of qi that you could theoretically absorb from a tree or a mineral or a waterfall, or if you're a vampiric left-hand path abusive individual, even theoretically from other human beings. It's not. It is a non-thing that is beyond comprehension and beyond any of the 5 senses, and even the mind itself, and probably even, like, for example, someone with a third eye open who can see auras. It's not that either. It is the energy of the Tao that has, as long as you use this character to describe it, you're referring to something that is non-existent. And yet there's a paradox, and this is an extraordinarily important paradox to familiarize with if one is interested in cultivating especially Taoist arts, is that this non-existent thing, we are only calling it non-existent from the standpoint of our human existence. And the problem with that is that it's actually beyond duality. And so we're using language to try to sort of say what it's not, which therefore necessitates saying it's non-existent or it's empty. And yet, from its own standpoint, it just is. So the thing about this qi is there's no way to get there. There's no technique to activate it. There's no pill that can contain it. There's no one who can zap you with it. And yet, counterintuitively and paradoxically, the teachings are that to the person who cultivates an empty mind and non-doing wu-wei, it begins to become active. And why that is that by emptying the mind, and again, we're not talking about falling into a coma or a trance or a deep sleep or any kind of stupor, but rather a clear and tranquil qing jing state, then one removes the later heaven components of one's own being, basically, or puts them to rest temporarily, and then one begins to naturally cleave towards the Tao. But again, this can't be done. There's no hack. There's no trick. There's no technique other than simply, well, really just simplicity. There's only so far that words can go. Even a brilliant person with a lot of affinity for these teachings can hear them described extremely eloquently, but as you well know, it's still a matter of slow practice, like water trickling into stone as one gradually awakens to them.
I was going to say, I often find with the literature on these topics, you only I find I can only understand it when I have already experienced or understood the concept on a personal level. If I read something in a book and I don't understand it, I'm not really going to understand it by reading more. So,
and well, as to what you just said, I think I've had that experience many times, and I to respond to it, two things. It's very interesting. There's this sort of like phrase I've seen. I don't remember exactly how it's said in Chinese, but it's something along the lines of like, first attain the Tao or first become enlightened, and then find a teacher, which sounds very counterintuitive. And I think, keen listeners who hear what you just said will say, then what is the point of all these books? What are you saying? You have to have had it first and then the books make sense? Well, if I don't already have it, then what's the point of the books, right? But I think you're right. You're not going to get any further by like taking the approach of like a person preparing for a math test by reading these books. But if you sort of read them with an open mind and even a level of detachment, and essentially what you're doing is planting seeds in your mind, you then forget in a way, except you water them by practice. And then as your practice unfolds and new things happen over the course of months, years, or maybe even longer, and then it's like, aha, that is what was being pointed to with those words. And there's something about having already encountered the teaching, and then it begins to come to fruition. It begins to sprout in one's own body and mind, where there's a very positive relationship between the information you've absorbed and what's occurring in real time in your practice. That does actually mean that there is a benefit to sort of reading above your level, be it in a spiritual text or even a practical manual of meditation techniques and the like.
I think that's a great way of putting it. On that note, thinking about when he talks about the idea, I'm assuming it's Tingjir you're translating, like the listening strength, and he compares it to the Buddhist notion of being able to listen to the clouds, which is something I like the idea of. I can't say I get yet. Maybe you could help elucidate it if you have any sort of ideas of this, because it was I read this only a few days ago and I was like, oh, that's really great. I need to think about that for a little bit.
I think what he's trying to express is, oh goodness, how to put this? He's trying to express, like, you need a character to, or a word to sort of speak about how you observe in the Taiji state, especially if you're doing push hands or even combat, right? And his point is that, like, the word listen is chosen as an alternative to feel, specifically because it kind of doesn't make sense. Because if you said feel the other combatant, feel your opponent, person might be too prone to be like, oh, I know what it means to feel. Because, you know, if I want to feel the texture of an object, I rub it. And if I want to, you know, feel temperature, I touch it. But if you just see the word to feel, or like chu, right, in Chinese, then you might kind of stop there. But instead you're given this word that makes no sense. And it's not to say that you use your ear in any specific way, and rather to say that you take in what you're observing in the combat or push hand situation in a much more whole manner, in a much more subtle manner. And I believe, basically, if I was trying to put it into words, it's kind of like taking in what you're observing of your opponent whilst remaining with a totally empty mind. So don't focus on any particular point on that person's body, because that will cause your mind, in a way, to tense up and to zero in, and which will of necessity take you out of the wuji state and even just drop you into totally into Hou Tian. Whereas later heaven. Whereas if you keep your mind empty, you remain in the Xian Tian, the prior heaven state, and therefore capable of using your internal martial arts. And I can offer an example where I can make this sound a little bit more practical. Because one of my visits where I went to see Master Ren, it might have been my last visit, he had me sort of stand up and just do sort of free push hands with him. And I hadn't seen him for a few months, and you know, I'm not here in Taipei with a push hands partner, so it doesn't matter that I'm training every day. I'm not training push hands, and he's kind of pushing me around, and you know, I described in the footnotes in the book what it feels like to be pushed around by him, and I'm kind of like helpless. And after he's toyed with me for a couple of minutes, he's like, "Just remember, keep your mind on Mingmen. Forget everything else." And I'm like, oh, okay, right. Yeah, of course, that's what you're always saying. So I do it. And very interestingly, immediately he was no longer able to toy with me as he had just been doing, because I forgot, in a way, you know, in that way where language ceases to fully make sense, but I forgot his body. I even forgot my body, and I just sort of empty my mind and focus on Mingmen and let Mingmen react to him and let Mingmen move me. And move me in tandem with his movements. And again, he immediately couldn't toy with me the way he had just been doing. And it's kind of funny. He's just like, all right, well, that's done. You know, it's like, he's like, you got the point, you know, and it's like, at that point, I really wanted to play. I was like, oh, I can get you now. But he was like, no, you got it, you know, next. So when my point bringing that little story up is when these very abstract, almost surreal, almost ridiculous sounding terms start to get them to work in your own body, it works right away. And the effects are palpable. Because like I said, this guy's way of controlling my body, he lost it immediately. Even though he's the teacher, because that's the teaching.
Yeah, right. And is this what he means when he's talking about, from his perspective, Shen, or using the mind first and the body being an extension or emanation of that? Is that are they sort of two very similar ideas in his teachings?
For certain, but my level of experience is not really high enough where I feel that I can make accurate statements. I wish I could, but there's a point at which it's like, despite having translated the book and read it so many times and met with Master Ren, to actually like really and truly be using Shen is beyond my pay grade. Yeah, I have to be honest and say that.
The other thing I really liked about the book was when he was talking about it doesn't matter what style of practice you're doing, whether you're doing Chen style or Yang style or whatever, that you possess this sort of internal essence of a Tai Chi practice, and it can manifest in very different ways. And that's how he explains how, you know, the different members of the Yang family manifested different sort of techniques.
Right.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And yeah, you don't see much of that in the martial arts world. There's a lot of combativeness and competition, I guess, between the different schools.
Right. And actually, this is interesting. It's a problem that mars Chinese medicine's ability to really progress as well. It's something about these vaguely esoteric internal arts and the tendency towards holding secrets and establishing separate lineages and then getting involved in all kinds of social protocols. And it just causes this endless bifurcation, and people split off into their own realms and don't really communicate that much with each other, which is to the detriment of the arts. And that is something that Ren is very interested in trying to ameliorate in internal martial arts. But I do want to add something from my own personal experience about, I think there's limits to how much you can say his teachings can work with every Taiji form that's out there, because I learned a Wudang form a long time ago in Shanghai, which I've seen performed by people in the older generations, and it's performed in a very, let's just say, not fit for like demonstrations and YouTube videos way. It's just kind of like very high, very upright, very slow, very boring looking. I mean, it really looks like, what is this, a martial art? And when I was younger, I was really not interested in practicing anything that way. But the way it was taught to me was by a teacher who had kind of really modified it to make it look more like wushu performance, which at that age I really liked. And I do recall that, however, like a lot of my fellow students who were working really hard were getting knee problems left, right, and center from that form. And I did too. So eventually I put it down and stopped practicing it when I left Shanghai, even though it's a really beautiful way of moving the body. But, you know, so anyway, years go by, and now that I've learned these Neigong instructions from Ren Gang, I thought, well, I haven't had the time to learn his Tai Chi form. Why don't I dig up my old form and put his instructions in it? After all, I really enjoyed doing that form, and it's very beautiful. And I experimented with this for only like 2 or 3 days, and I realized I just had to abandon it, because the way I had been taught it, it's impossible to move from the Mingmen, because there's all these instances where you're kind of like moving your leg first, and then it's demanded of you to hold stances that violate the body's own natural internal mechanics, which by that point I'd become very familiar with what is natural and what allows for open, whole body connected strength. What I translate often as equipollence in the book, and which ways of holding the body just cause that to break down, because they're not rooted in that understanding of having a oneness in the body. And that's one of the things that wushu, with its very beautiful acrobatic, even dance-like routines, they're extremely pleasing to the eye, but really violates internal martial arts principles. And so when people speak about why the internal martial arts are in a degenerate state in many instances. I can tell you one reason is they're too beautiful now. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've met, a few internal martial artists in China over the years, and I didn't understand this when I was younger, but they'll say real martial arts aren't pretty.
Yeah.
And I'd always think, well, why not? They should be.
I've heard it a lot of times. Yeah.
Well, like if you see videos of Ren doing his Tai Chi, it ain't pretty. I mean, it has a flow and it has the equipoise, but it does not look like wushu. And funny enough, I said earlier in this interview, like as I plugged in his neigong to my baguazhang and my xingyiquan, oh man, it doesn't look anything like I used to do it. It's slow and becoming slower all the time, and often, unless the qi is very open in some instances and my body naturally wants to go to low, it's kind of like these big high stances. And he did not tell me to move like that. Never. It's just that's what my body is doing as it becomes governed by the Ningmen. It just becomes so obvious, like there's no other way to move that would be healthy for me at this point in time. But it doesn't mean tomorrow it will look the exact same way. It may be different tomorrow depending on what the state of my qi is the next day. And so I don't know if you remember the 2008 Olympics. There's that scene of like several thousand people in the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing doing the Yang 24 form exactly the same way. And you can just imagine they trained that for hours every day for like a year. Everyone like a machine trying to look like a photocopy of the guy next to him. Oh, it's such a violation of real internal martial arts, because your Jingqi and Shen this morning are not going to be the same tonight, much less will they be the same as Joe Schmo standing next to you.
We had Jackie Chan busting out the karaoke at the closing ceremony, and I think his Jingqi and Shen were just perfect then. So, it might have made up for it.
Oh, yeah, Jackie Chan, man, he makes up for everything. Except for his political views, but we don't have to talk about that.
We don't. Another thing which I really liked about the book, and I'd found in my own practice, something difficult to separate. I've never been able to separate things, character cultivation from my practice. I've never been able to separate it, especially when I got more into the neigong and internal kind of things, that I'd notice if I was making progress physically, something was happening in my personality or psychology or emotions, and things were changing on that front as well. And I think he's very big on that in the book. Could you maybe talk about it a little more? He seems very much to be a sort of gentleman martial artist, kind of in the style of Sun Lutang. That kind of idea. That's the impression I get from the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I gave this some thought yesterday after we spoke about it, and how to put it? I think if we grew up in the West, we have a certain way of looking at morals that it's sort of like morals are morals, and you adopt them and maintain them because that's good. And well, first of all, you go back to very ancient ideas from religion, like you won't go to hell and you will go to heaven. In most, not all, but general schools of sort of Judeo-Christian Muslim beliefs. And then, there might be also more practical views as well. Like, if you're moral, then you'll make fewer enemies and you'll make more friends, and you'll get yourself into less shitty situations that you have to like clean up later. Like, so, have moral, you're right. And there's that exists in Chinese culture for sure. But Ren's approach to morals is kind of like a more deep level. And it's not to say everyone's got to start somewhere. Like, to begin a person's introductions to living a life with principles and integrity by giving them a teaching like, if you don't, you might go to hell. That's training wheels. And Ren's is much more on like, you're well beyond the training wheel stage. And it's at the stage where your character cultivation has to exist in order for you to make progress on your energetic cultivation. Because how to put this, a person who's going through life making an endless series of really selfish, antisocial, even cruel decisions, the foundation of the mindset that spurs a person into behaving this way is invariably rooted on a notion of the individual as separate. This closes the door to empathy, and also opens the gate to a type of thinking where delusion causes a person to become convinced that it's necessary to hoard resources, be they opportunities, be they money, be they power, control over other individuals. And the only reason a person is convinced that that needs to be done, again, is the person has no notion of themselves existing as a part of this unified whole of the Tao. Now, of course, that's a very hard thing to wrap the mind around, because we certainly have a sense of ourselves as individuals, and we're responsible for our own actions. And so, in a way, that's why this is a high-level teaching. And I'm reminded of a really beautiful passage at the end of John Blofeld's book on Taoism. This is a guy who went to China pre-World War II and stayed there for 17 years and really devoted himself to traveling around seeking out Buddhist and Taoist masters among his other pursuits. A very sincere cultivator. And he ends up meeting this Taoist master called Zong Laowong, which is some just old fellow Zeng. No, and I've never been able to find a record of who this person was, but it was a traveling Taoist master who many people believed had reached the highest levels of cultivation. And Blofeld was very fortunate, and when the master was briefly in Beijing, he got the chance to go visit him. And so Zong Laowong asks Blofeld, well, tell me, in the West, what do your sages say enlightenment is? And Blofeld says, well, I don't know who he's quoting, but so-and-so mystic says that when you become enlightened, it's a bit like a drop of water dropping into the ocean. It's been separate all along, and it finally joins the ocean, and it sort of loses itself in the ocean. It's no longer separate. And this old master is very satisfied with the answer. He's like, well, I'm really happy you shared that with me. It shows that sages in your part of the world also, that they have very deep insight as well. It's wonderful to hear. This is, going back to early 20th century, there's very little communication between China and the West. And many Chinese people's main impression of the West is as an aggressive, invading set of powers, right? But then Zong Laowong says, but despite the fact that I really think that what you just shared with me is a very good teaching, it's nothing to shake a stick at, it's still missing a point, which is that there's this paradox. I keep using this word in this interview. I wish I had another word, but it's that not only does the drop lose its individuality as it merges with the whole ocean, the drop also gains the whole ocean. So the drop is still the drop. It's still the individual. And now it has expanded to encompass all things. Now, we can only get so far with that verbal analogy. But where this ties back into character is that, and again, back into the martial arts, internal martial arts in specific, and Taoist cultivation, Buddhist cultivation, and Ren's notions of Confucian cultivation in general, is that you cannot progress beyond a certain level unless you have that mind where you at once are not an individual, not separate, and yet your individuality is so broad and in fact magnanimous that it encompasses all things. And Taoism, we see the three treasures, Jing, Qi, Shen, right? And if you study them, and you're reminded at a certain point, Jing, Qi, Shen are all one. uh, and especially prior heaven, Jing, Qi, and Shen, are just three different ways of speaking about the same thing. And being prior heaven in nature, it doesn't belong to any one person. It doesn't have any one shape or form. It's that which infuses all things. And you can't make it accessible to yourself if your mind is trapped in on little old me trying to get over on the next guy, trying to, accumulate a little corner of good fortune just for myself in this dung heap of teeming humanity. You got to kind of rise above that. Otherwise, you're just not going to transcend to the level where prior heaven Qi has anything to do with you because you blocked it out yourself. My little mini sermon on that.
No,
it makes sense.
I really enjoyed it, and my mind kind of went to, in the West, but it's everywhere now. How individualism is really the dominant force, and
yeah.
I think it's
and in modern China too.
And in modern China, it's worldwide now, and how it has it does have an empowering effect, but it's also incredibly isolating. And I think we're really starting to see the downside of it in our society. So it's nice to hear the flip side, and part of that could be the lack of a real spiritual core in our society, anywhere in the world, really.
Well, that's the thing is, I think, religion remains a powerful force around the world, but unfortunately, I think a lot of, to say something very cynical and unfair in a way, because there are a lot of religious leaders who I have a lot of respect for, but if we're going to focus on some of the powerful negative currents inside of religion, they're kind of just demanding that people lose their individuality, they lose their, the right to make decisions for themselves. And it's really tricky that point that Zheng Laoong makes in John Blofeld's records, is that how do you wrap your mind around you both lose your individuality and yet you gain a new sense of self that includes the old you, the individual you, and broadly reaches out to encompass something much bigger than the limited self. It's not like any of us can wake up tomorrow and get it. And the getting of it is like, it's a trickle over the course of years as we continue to fuck up in many ways, we're not going to get there in one fell swoop. So it's a big project for all of humanity to start to develop this.
Yeah, well, I think on that note we'll start to wrap up. But I look forward to seeing how you've developed with your trickle in our next conversation.
Well, people who know me well might say it's a very slow trickle.
Yeah, but thanks a lot for your time, and I enjoyed reading the book. The book is out now, published by Purple Cloud Press, and it's a great read, and I'd really recommend it to anyone out there interested in Tai Chi or Chinese philosophy. It's really quite wide-ranging. And thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure as always.
And we'll be...
by the way, shout out to the Lizards crew.
Okay, I think you did that last time. I'm not sure who they are, but I have to check them out.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
No worries. I'll speak to you next time. I'd once again like to thank Mattias for taking the time out to talk to us today about his fantastic new translation of the Heart Treasure of Taijiquan. And just a reminder, it is available for purchase on our website, www.purplecloudinstitute.com. And that's it for me today. I'll see you next time.